Imagine stepping into a hospital where the walls breathe, where water drips in midair and tolls of unseen bells tug at your heartbeat. Patients' skin shimmers like liquid, organs sliding in slow, impossible rhythms, merging with the plaster as if the building itself is swallowing them. You try to look away, but every tile, every shadow, every suspended droplet pulls you into the pulse. By the time you realize the asylum has already claimed them, and maybe you too, it is too late. In the month of February, 1833, the walls of the Vienna asylum throbbed with a sound that existed before thought, a vibration that pressed into the soles of shoes and climbed the spine with slow, deliberate insistence. The first patient to arrive felt it as a tremor beneath the skin, a pulse that wound its way through veins and sinew until the body no longer belonged to itself, each heartbeat folding into the rhythm of the building as if it had learned to claim life in silence. Water dripped from the high ceilings, yet the sound was not the simple plink of liquid striking stone. It rang like 1,000 tiny bells, striking an impossible sync, each note threading through the chest and pressing the ribcage inward, tugging the mind into a cadence older than memory, older than fear. The corridors carried a smell of wet plaster and iron, a cold, coppery tang that clung to tongues and nostrils, coating lungs with the impression of decay and metal, an odor that seemed to speak of bodies that had passed through these halls long before and had been pressed into them, a residue of presence that refused to dissipate. Staff moved quietly, whispering to one another of the new doctor who had arrived from the east, a thin, angular figure whose shadow always lingered too long, stretching along walls that themselves seemed to flex, contracting and swelling imperceptibly as though the asylum were breathing, drawing air into its ribs and exhaling it with slow, deliberate patience. He walked without cane or companion, hands raised slightly as if conducting an unseen orchestra, and those who passed him felt a subtle resistance in the air, a tugging that made steps uncertain, muscles trembling against a force they could not name. Patients wandered the halls, some shivering with a cold that came not from the weather, but from the very pulse threading through marble and plaster, their skin twitching unnaturally, as if the hum beneath it dictated the rhythm of muscle and sinew, their hearts sinking with a cadence that did not belong to the living. Every door they passed whispered of secrets pressed into the wood. Every window reflected not sunlight, but fragments of themselves already liquefying, as if the asylum had begun to dissolve them in advance. In the treatment rooms, pipes leaked steadily, dripping in uneven patterns that seemed deliberate, a choreography of droplets that fell not to the floor, but hovered briefly in air, catching torchlight and refracting it into the eyes of those who dared look too long. The faint clanging of distant bells joined the rhythm of water and pulse, a resonance that threaded through every corridor, winding into hair follicles, wrapping around tendons, pulling consciousness inward and outward simultaneously. Floors flexed subtly beneath weight, tilting imperceptibly, and tiles creaked in patterns that resembled movement of unseen limbs, pressing into perception a suggestion that the asylum itself had learned to crawl. The first patient fell to knees, skin quivering with a metallic sheen, eyes wide as if seeing through the body into the fluid beneath, organs pulsing with liquid motion, a spectacle that no one else could yet perceive, but that left a residue of nausea and awe in the air. The doctor passed without glance, continuing his circuit, shadow trailing against the walls, stretching and twisting, elongating in impossible angles, and the hum of the building grew louder in response, a slow, measured insistence that coiled around the pulse of every living thing present, threading the day into a rhythm that no tongue could describe, no mind could resist, and by the time night settled over Vienna, the asylum had already begun to fold its first patient into the rhythm, claiming skin, sinew, and memory as if it had waited centuries for this slow, deliberate awakening. In the month of March, 1833, the changes among the patients became undeniable, a slow transformation that unfolded with a rhythm as precise and inevitable as the tolling of the asylum's distant bells. Skin lost its firmness, beginning to ripple and flow like water over solid bones, catching the flickering torchlight in impossible ways, veins gleaming like molten silver that traced currents under translucent flesh. Muscles swayed in undulating waves, contracting and stretching not according to thought or will, but in obedience to a deeper, imperceptible cadence, a rhythm that seemed older than the asylum itself, threaded into the floorboards, the plaster, the very air that hung thick with the smell of wet stone and metal. Eyes, once fixed and human, began to bulge and retreat, pupils dilating to impossible sizes, irises flickering with reflections of dripping water, as if the internal organs beneath were mirroring the surface world, folding themselves into patterns of liquid motion that no mind could trace. Fingers elongated in subtle arcs, curling and uncurling like tendrils of a slow-moving tide, and hands, when lifted, seemed to bend with the weight of water they contained, the veins beneath glimmering as if carrying currents too dense and too alive to be blood alone. Each bell in the tower above struck in hollow, deliberate tones, threaded through sinew and marrow, and every note dragged the limbs of the patients into contortions that were grotesque yet strangely deliberate, a choreography dictated not by gravity but by the pulse of the asylum itself. Floors groaned beneath weight, tiles flexing and giving with a pressure that seemed alive, walls swelled imperceptibly, pressing against beds and gurneys, folding those who lay upon them into the architecture, bending torsos to the rhythm of a heartbeat that belonged to neither human nor machine. Nurses discovered with dawning terror that their bodies no longer obeyed commands. Trays refused to lift, the metal of instruments resonated with the pulse, and their limbs vibrated in sync with the invisible wave that carried every motion from patient to wall to ceiling. They watched in horror as liquids within patients shifted visibly beneath skin that had become nearly transparent, organs pulsing and folding in liquid harmonics that mimicked the drip and splash of water from leaking pipes above. Some patients began to float slightly above the floor, buoyed by a force that seemed to emerge from the walls themselves, their bodies bending in impossible arcs, torsos twisting in slow spirals, spines stretching as if drawn by invisible threads into the angles of the room. The sound of dripping water became a symphony, each drop landing not merely on the tile, but resonating through air, bone, and flesh, pressing consciousness into a state of pliable terror, a rhythm that forced thought and will to bend into submission. Mirrors reflected not what the eyes could see but what the walls had absorbed, and those who gazed too long saw themselves dissolving, veins shimmering, internal fluids rising in visible waves, faces elongating in subtle, cruel exaggerations of their own expressions. The asylum itself responded, a living participant in this slow metamorphosis. Corridors contracted and stretched with a deliberate undulation, ceilings dipping imperceptibly before rising, plaster bulging with the pressure of unseen tides. Pipes groaned and moaned in response to the bell tones, dripping water that refracted the flickering torchlight into strobing patterns across the trembling bodies, a spectacle at once beautiful and grotesque, hypnotic and repulsive. Even the air seemed to pulse, thickening as if infused with a liquid memory, pressing against lungs, forcing breath into measured, involuntary cadence that matched the undulations of skin and organ beneath. Some patients screamed, voices bending and stretching into tones not human, oscillating with the toll of distant bells, echoing off walls that shivered and contracted as if swallowing sound and body alike. Others remained still, faces pale and shining, eyes blank yet alive with the reflection of their own interior liquefaction, every movement of sinew and tissue orchestrated by the rhythm of dripping water, each patient a note in the symphony the asylum conducted through the bodies of the living. Staff could no longer distinguish their own motions from the pulse of the building, their hands trembling in sympathy with the flexing floors, their hearts accelerating in tune with the swell of organs beneath the thin skin of those in their care. Beds warped beneath bodies, folding into walls as if the building itself had developed a slow, deliberate appetite, swallowing limbs, torsos, and faces into the plaster, leaving behind only rippling traces in the shape of muscles and bones beneath skin that glimmered with reflective liquidity. The doctor moved through the ward with deliberate ease, hands raised slightly as though coaxing the water like motions from patient to ceiling, from sinew to wall, his shadow stretching and undulating across plaster like a black river, elongating in impossible angles as the pulse of the asylum clung to his movements, a resonance both subtle and overpowering. Each droplet of water that fell from a tap or pipe joined the rhythm, not as a single sound, but as part of a tidal chorus, carrying momentum that bent limbs, twisted torsos, and stretched flesh. The longer the patients existed in this rhythm, the more indistinguishable the line became between their bodies and the architecture, as veins shimmered into the pattern of tiles, organs flowed in waves that mirrored the plaster of walls, and their very presence seemed absorbed into the undulating motion of floorboards, ceilings, and arches. Time itself became elastic. Minutes folded into hours as each bell tolled, dragging consciousness into the invisible currents of water, metal, and skin. Some who had wandered the ward in the morning were gone by afternoon, their forms untraceable, though the pulse and shimmer of their internal fluids remained, imprinting a memory into the plaster, a residue of presence that could be felt if the hand pressed against walls that flexed with subtle insistence. Shadows stretched and twisted along floors, climbing walls and coiling around limbs, a reflection not of light, but of the liquid motion inside bodies, the hum of the building threading through every sinew until thought itself became a pliable, trembling substance, bending to the will of dripping water and distant bells. By the time dusk settled over Vienna, the entire ward had become a single organism, a collective of pulse and fluid, skin and architecture, vibrating in delicate, deliberate waves that left no part of the human form untouched, no consciousness free from the slow, inexorable choreography of water, bell, and flesh, a transformation both horrifying and exquisite, a slow absorption into a rhythm older than any patient could remember, older than reason, older than life itself. By the month of March, 1833, the asylum had ceased to exist as a mere building and had become a living, breathing participant in the transformations that gripped its wards. Water from the taps no longer obeyed gravity. It hung suspended in midair, forming droplets that shimmered with impossible clarity, stretching and twisting before scattering in arcs that defied reason, splashing against tiles with a sound that resonated through bone and marrow. The bells above tolled in hollow, deliberate sequences, each note folding over the last, embedding itself deep within memory, threading through the nerves and sinews of anyone who lingered too long, until the flesh of the living rippled with a cadence not of their own making. Floors shifted subtly beneath steps, tiles flexing like skin, creaking with the weight of presence and absence, while walls expanded and contracted in slow, undulating waves, pressing against beds and gurneys, absorbing those who lay upon them into the very structure of the building. Each patient became a note in a symphony conducted by the asylum itself, limbs bending in impossible directions, torsos twisting in arcs that mirrored the swell and fall of water droplets in suspended flight. The doctor moved with slow, deliberate grace, hands lifted as if conducting, eyes glinting like metal in the torchlight, shadow trailing behind him in impossible angles, stretching across walls that flexed and swelled as though responding to his will. Mirrors no longer reflected simple movement. They anticipated it, showing translucent figures flowing independently of their solid counterparts, sometimes brushing walls before the hand arrived, sometimes rising into the air with a buoyancy that mocked the rules of gravity. Pipes groaned in response to the pulse of the building, dripping water that caught torchlight and split it into spectral prisms across the faces and bodies of those who dared to look. The smell of wet plaster and metal had deepened into something almost sentient, a coppery tang so strong it clung to tongues and filled lungs, pressing each breath into the rhythm of the asylum, threading through sinew, marrow, and thought. Patients floated slightly above floors, bodies bending in arcs that were impossible yet beautiful in their fluidity, torsos rolling like liquid, skin stretched thin and translucent, veins glimmering with currents that traced paths across bodies like rivers of quicksilver. Some fell to the ground in spasms, their organs shifting in visible waves beneath skin that quivered as if it were water itself, eyes rolling back, catching reflections of the dripping water and the distant bells, each reflection folding them deeper into the cadence of the asylum. Even the staff were drawn into the rhythm. Their muscles trembled involuntarily, hands resisting simple motions, feet stepping in time with a pulse they could neither see nor command, a resonance that wove together their bones and sinews with the undulating bodies of patients and the flexible architecture of walls and floors. Beds bent and folded into walls, mattresses sinking into plaster, springs curling and twisting as if alive, leaving only the impression of shifting flesh pressed into the surfaces of the building. The longer one remained, the more indistinguishable became the line between body and architecture, skin and tile, sinew and floorboard. Each patient's movements echoed through walls, their organs flowing in waves mirrored in the curves of the ceiling and arches, their translucent forms repeated infinitely in mirrors that now multiplied presence into abstraction. Even corridors had begun to live. They elongated and contracted subtly, ceilings dipping imperceptibly before rising, arches flexing as though inhaling and exhaling, drawing all who entered into a slow, deliberate rhythm dictated by the combined will of water, bell, and plaster. The hum of dripping water threaded through every tendon and fiber of muscle, resonating with internal organs, pressing consciousness into pliable shapes that bent thought and perception alike, and those who attempted to flee found doors stretching just beyond reach, corridors folding to swallow steps into themselves, guiding bodies into arcs they could not resist. Shadows had grown thick, pooling along walls, climbing floors and curling around torsos, pressing against ankles, coiling like black liquid over flesh, reflecting the internal undulations of skin and muscle in silent mockery. Faces pressed against mirrors no longer belonged solely to the living. They overlapped with translucent forms, organs visible beneath shifting skin, eyes rolling with the cadence of water, mouths opening and closing in silent synchronization with the tolling bells. Time became meaningless, minutes folded into hours, each bell toll dragging consciousness ever deeper into the pulsing rhythm of liquid flesh and flexible architecture. Patients who had entered in the morning now floated or pressed against walls in ways that seemed impossible to human perception, their veins shining like molten metal, torsos twisting in fluid arcs that the mind could barely trace, their presence imprinted on plaster, reflected infinitely in glass, mirrored endlessly in the curves of tiles and arches. The doctor moved without haste through this theater of transformation, his shadow stretching along walls and floors, limbs elongated and bending into impossible angles, his eyes bright with the reflection of dripping water, his hands orchestrating without touch. Even the very air seemed to pulse, thick with moisture and memory, pressing against lungs, tugging at hair, threading through every nerve ending to compel motion, bending the living into the architecture of the asylum itself. The building hummed with consciousness, each wall and ceiling vibrating in subtle sync with the bells and the undulating forms of skin and organ, drawing all life into a single, cohesive rhythm, an organism of plaster, bone, sinew, and water. By the end of the day, the asylum no longer appeared merely inhabited. It had become an entity in which the living were fluid components, limbs and organs and thoughts absorbed into the undulating, pulsing whole, a symphony of dripping water, tolling bells, and the unceasing flow of translucent flesh pressed into walls, floors, and mirrors, each patient and staff member a note in a composition older than reason, older than fear, older than life itself. In the month of April, 1833, the asylum's pulse intensified, a tide of sound that pressed deep into the lungs, vibrating through ribs, sinew, and marrow until breath itself became a labor of obedience. The bells, once distant and hollow, now tolled as though inside every chamber, threading resonance through walls, floorboards, and ceilings, their tones curling around the bodies of patients, embedding a rhythm older than human thought, older than reason, older than life. Patients drifted from their beds without effort, their bodies buoyant, limbs bending in arcs that no hand could command, torsos twisting like ribbons of liquid beneath translucent skin. Internal fluids sloshed and shimmered with the cadence of dripping water, organs shifting in visible waves beneath skin stretched thin and almost ethereal, veins glowing faintly as they carried currents of impossible liquid light. The walls themselves began to move with deliberate, insidious grace, folding, rolling, and expanding as though the asylum had grown sentient overnight. Corridors elongated and twisted upon themselves, ceilings dipping in undulating arcs, plaster swelling to press against beds and gurneys, bending the living into shapes the mind could not trace. Floors tilted subtly underfoot, tiles flexing and groaning as if resisting human weight, while water from broken pipes hung suspended in air, droplets stretching and coiling, falling in patterns that mimicked the internal rhythms of patience, splashing in slow-motion symphonies that echoed endlessly through the hollow halls. Staff attempted intervention, lifting trays, grasping limbs, trying to direct bodies back to their beds, but every touch was met with resistance, flesh and bone vibrating, bending, and rippling against their hands, as though the asylum itself rejected solidity and demanded obedience to its inexorable pulse. Each corridor seemed alive, walls curling inward to press against shoulders, then recoiling, drawing steps into elongated paths where gravity shifted unpredictably, ceilings lowering just enough to brush air, arches flexing as though breathing in concert with every heartbeat, every organ, every suspended droplet of water. Mirrors multiplied these distortions, reflecting not only the physical forms of the patients but the currents of liquid within them, torsos twisting in impossible directions, veins glowing in spectral silver, organs sliding in waves that no eye could hold for more than a moment. Shadows thickened, spreading along the walls and floors like black smoke made tangible, coiling around ankles, curling over beds, reaching toward ceilings in delicate arcs that mirrored the undulations of the patient's internal fluids. The doctor moved among them with silent authority, hands lifted slightly, eyes glinting like metal in the torchlight, a conductor without baton, orchestrating every tremor of sinew, every wave of organ, every ripple of liquid skin. He glided through the halls with impossible grace, shadows stretching behind him, elongating along the moving plaster, sliding over tiles as though the building itself were his instrument. Even the air seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the asylum, thick with moisture, metallic tang, and the subtle coppery scent of dissolved flesh, pressing into every lung, brushing through hair, threading through nerves, compelling movement that was at once voluntary and impossible to resist. Patients floated and drifted in arcs dictated by the combined will of water, bell, and plaster, sometimes colliding with walls that flexed to absorb them, sometimes rising into suspended rotations that defied gravity, torsos twisting while limbs melted into architecture, skin glimmering with currents of fluid light. Beds were drawn into walls with gentle, deliberate force, mattresses curling into plaster, springs bending as though alive, leaving only impressions of shifting flesh pressed into surfaces, a memory of motion embedded in the very material of the building. The longer one remained, the more indistinguishable became the line between patient and asylum, flesh and tile, organ and plaster, until thought itself bent to the cadence of dripping water, bell, and invisible pulse. The hum of suspended droplets threaded through marrow, pressing consciousness into pliable forms that mirrored the rhythm of internal fluids, each patient a note in a symphony conducted without visible hands, without tangible instrument, a rhythm older than life and older than memory. Shadows multiplied, stretching and curling across floors, climbing walls, coiling over torsos, pressing against ankles, their black mass reflecting the rippling, flowing interiors of bodies, the undulating currents of organ and vein in silent, cruel mockery. Faces pressed to mirrors elongated, twisted, sometimes dissolving into translucent forms that anticipated movement before it occurred, eyes rolling back, veins shining like molten metal, torsos twisting into arcs that the human mind could not comprehend. The asylum itself breathed with increasing awareness, walls pulsing in delicate undulations, ceilings dipping in arcs that pressed the living into shapes both grotesque and exquisite, corridors stretching to draw steps into impossible loops, every motion absorbed and returned in altered, exaggerated repetition. Even the staff could not escape the influence. Muscles trembled involuntarily, hearts beating in sync with the pulsing current of dripping water, sinews bending with the same deliberate undulations as the patients beneath their care. Pipes groaned, the hum of water droplets creating a resonance that carried the memory of bodies pressed into walls and floors, a symphony of liquid flesh and sentient plaster that threaded through every corner of the asylum, tugging at consciousness, bending the perception of space, time, and gravity. By nightfall, the asylum was no longer a hospital but an organism, each wall, floorboard, ceiling, and body vibrating in concert with the others, every droplet of water, every tolling bell, every ripple of skin, organ, and vein a single note in an endless symphony of transformation. The doctor moved through this living composition, shadow trailing, eyes bright with reflected liquid, hands raised slightly, guiding every tremor, every twist, every ripple, a conductor of flesh and building alike, orchestrating the consumption of the living into the rhythm of the asylum itself, until all motion became indistinguishable from architecture, all life absorbed into the undulating pulse that had begun long before any patient arrived, older than fear, older than memory, older than life. By the month of May, 1833, the line between patient, staff, and asylum had dissolved entirely, leaving only a single, undulating organism of flesh, plaster, and water, vibrating with a pulse that seemed to originate from some place older than memory. The walls breathed in slow, deliberate arcs, inhaling the heat and substance of those pressed against them, exhaling a cold, metallic tang that clung to the tongue and settled in the lungs like a second breath. Flesh flowed seamlessly into plaster, veins and sinews pressing against walls before sliding into the corners and arches, merging with the architecture until the eye could not discern where body ended and building began. Organs pooled upon the floors in columns of liquid light, spinning briefly before rising in suspended arcs that mirrored the slow sway of corridors, the dipping and curling of ceilings, the quivering of tiles beneath weight that seemed both present and absent. The bells tolled in time with this new heartbeat, hollow yet resonant, folding consciousness into liquid form, dragging memory and identity from the chest and marrow of the living, pressing it into the very substance of the asylum, embedding it into the plaster and tiles, the cracks in the floors, the curling arches above. Blood shimmered with coppery light, sinews glimmered like spun silver, and eyes, if they could still be called such, floated as translucent orbs within torsos that rolled and twisted in arcs that were impossible to the mind, bending along the rhythm of water droplets that hung suspended, quivering midair before splashing into resonant, echoing pools. Even the air itself vibrated with the cadence, thick with the tang of metal, wet plaster, and dissolved flesh, pressing against lungs and brushing through hair, threading into nerve endings, tugging muscles into motions that were not voluntary, yet felt inevitable, as though obedience were written into sinew and marrow. The staff no longer moved independently. Their limbs bent, flexed, and rippled in arcs dictated by the building, hands lifting trays and guiding patients without conscious thought, faces stretched in silent awe, eyes reflecting not the world but the endless, pulsing rhythm of the asylum. Corridors elongated and contracted like the chambers of some massive living heart, ceilings dipping to brush shoulders, arches curling inward and outward in slow waves, floorboards bending and shifting beneath feet as if each step were another toll of the great internal bell. Water fell from broken pipes in suspended arcs, coiling, twisting, splashing in patterns that mirrored the flow of organs and veins, catching torchlight and fracturing it into spectral prisms that shimmered across translucent skin and plaster alike. Shadows thickened, folding over limbs and torsos, coiling like black ribbons that echoed the movement of internal currents, pressing against floors and walls with a deliberate insistence that tugged the living into alignment with the building's rhythm. Mirrors had multiplied this effect infinitely. Reflections no longer depicted simple reality, but layers of liquid flesh, organ, vein, bone, and plaster, interweaving into a continuous, undulating motion, an impossible choreography of movement that no human eye could fully comprehend. The doctor was nowhere and everywhere at once, his presence stitched invisibly into every wall, every puddle, every suspended droplet, guiding the transformations with hands that moved without touch, shadow trailing along the undulating surfaces, eyes glinting like molten metal, body bending and stretching in impossible loops. Even those who had fled the asylum, stumbling into the streets of Vienna, could feel the pulse in cobblestones beneath boots, in the river flowing sluggishly through the city, in the stones of buildings pressed by centuries of rain, and the tolling of distant bells carried a resonance that pressed into the chest and marrow, tugging at consciousness, calling them back into the wave of sound and liquid flesh. Memory and identity were no longer secure. Each breath drew fragments from the living into the liquid architecture of the asylum, weaving presence and absence into a single, continuous flow, the pulse older than reason, older than fear, older than life itself. The city outside remained indifferent, horse-drawn carriages rattling over stones, wind carrying the scent of wood smoke. But for anyone who had known the asylum, nothing was untouched by its rhythm. Each heartbeat mirrored the tolling bells, each footstep aligned with suspended water, each inhalation threaded with the pulse of flesh flowing into walls. Floors quivered with the weight of invisible, shifting bodies, walls pressed outward and inward with the tide of organs and veins, ceilings dipped to touch heads, and then rose again. Corridors folded over themselves to contain steps and loops that defied all linear understanding. Faces pressed against mirrors, if mirrors could still be called such, reflected torsos twisting, veins glowing in silver, organs rising and falling in suspended harmony, shadows coiling and uncoiling in tandem with the pulse of dripping water. The asylum breathed as a singular entity, walls, floors, ceilings, patients, staff, and the ever-present bell tones fused into one undulating whole, each tremor and ripple orchestrated in perfect, unending rhythm. And in the center of this living composition, the doctor moved silently, shadow trailing, eyes bright with reflected liquid, hands raised slightly, conducting not bodies, not walls, but the very essence of presence itself, drawing every fragment of flesh, bone, sinew, and memory into the wave, into the pulse, into the unceasing, terrifying, beautiful tide of the asylum that would not cease, that would claim all, that had become older than life, older than fear, older than Vienna itself. By the month of June, 1833, the asylum stood empty of flesh, of staff, of patient, yet it pulsed as if alive, a vast organism of walls, water, plaster, and the faint, hollow resonance of bells that had learned to toll for the living and the unmade alike. Sunlight spilled across the roof, touching chimneys that smoked in quiet indifference, but inside, the air throbbed with an invisible tide, every brick and beam vibrating with the memory of those absorbed, every droplet of suspended water quivering in echo of hearts that had ceased to beat. Floors seemed to roll like gentle waves, each step a tremor that pressed the senses, tugged at muscles and sinew, threading into the bones of anyone who dared approach the doors. A traveler came by at dawn, boots clattering against the cobblestones, and paused before the building, drawn by a subtle, almost imperceptible pull, a rhythm older than thought, older than memory, older than life itself. He placed a hand upon the cold stone of the steps and felt it flex beneath his fingers, a gentle give as though the floor had softened, yielding to his weight, while simultaneously tugging back, bending his posture, threading into his very marrow. He raised his head and glanced through the tall, grimy windows, and the sight made his stomach clench. Shadows of bodies flowed across plaster as liquid figures, skin translucent, veins glimmering like molten silver, torsos rising and falling in arcs that mimicked the sway of dripping water, organs shifting in rhythm with the hollow tolling, mouths opening in silent, endless exhalations. eyes fixed in spectral awe that was neither living nor dead. The bells rang once more, faint, delicate, echoing through corridors that no human had walked in weeks, threading through walls and ceilings, curling around every arch, every column, every suspended droplet of water that hung in the air, spinning briefly before falling with a splash that reverberated like a pulse into the surrounding city. The traveler stepped backward instinctively, boots slipping slightly as tiles beneath seemed to ripple with the memory of liquid flesh pressed into them, veins of copper and silver gleaming faintly through the plaster, as if the building itself exhaled and inhaled in perfect, unbroken rhythm. Shadows stretched along the walls, coiling and uncoiling, pressing against the floor, rising to touch the ceiling, the edges of arches curling in arcs that defied geometry, folding the empty space into shapes that teased comprehension, bending perception into folds that were at once familiar and utterly alien. The air smelled of wet plaster, copper, and something older, fouler, a memory of organs and sinew suspended in the walls, pressing into lungs with every inhalation, embedding themselves into hair, muscle, and tendon, threading the pulse of the vanished into the traveler's own heart, pulling, insisting, claiming even from outside the doors. He stumbled back from the windows, glancing down to see the steps shift imperceptibly, curling like water around his boots, as though the building measured weight and presence, adjusting, bending, absorbing without touch. From the upper floors came a faint vibration, a ripple that threaded through windows, down walls, through the stone beneath the traveler's feet, a sensation that brushed against skin and bone with deliberate insistence, tugging fingers and toes into alignment with a rhythm that had once consumed the living and now pressed against the absent. His eyes darted across corridors that could not be entered, glimpsing flowing bodies embedded in plaster, organs rising and falling like tides within translucent torsos, veins glowing, liquid light threading sinew into walls, the suspended droplets of water catching torchlight that was no longer there, fracturing into spectral prisms that multiplied endlessly across unseen surfaces. A slow, exhaled resonance passed through the building, curling around arches, pressing against ceilings, folding into floors, echoing across the city, a pulse that seemed to thread into streets and river, into stones and timber, into the very air above Vienna, tugging faintly at all who walked near, threading the invisible memory of transformation into the world beyond. The traveler could feel it in his chest, a subtle pressure, a tremor in tendons and spine that pressed him into stillness, bending attention and awareness to the rhythm, an echo of what had happened within, an imprint older than reason, older than life. He fell to his knees, eyes wide, and saw the faintest shimmer in the glass, torsos pressed into walls, hands curling along plaster, faces elongated and silent, endless expressions of exhaled terror, eyes glinting like molten metal, mouths open in muted tolling that harmonized with the bells, with the water, with the pulse threading through the empty building, threading through him. The bells tolled again, hollow and deliberate, and the asylum shivered, a vast, undulating entity of wall, floor, ceiling, and memory, sending a ripple through Vienna, as if the city itself had been absorbed into its rhythm, streets bending imperceptibly, river carrying the resonance, the very stones vibrating in subtle alignment with the tide of liquid flesh and plaster that had once consumed all who entered. Every droplet of water, every reflection in glass and tile, every ghost of muscle, sinew, and organ quivered in unison, the pulse unbroken, unyielding, older than fear, older than thought, older than the world outside. And as the traveler staggered away, drawn by instinct and terror, he felt in his bones the unrelenting insistence of the asylum, a rhythm that would not stop, a presence older than Vienna, older than life itself, pressing memory and body into a tide that flowed endlessly, silently, invisibly, leaving nothing untouched, leaving nothing living, leaving only the wet, metallic pulse of walls that had learned to breathe, to consume, to toll for eternity.